So the inquiry is, what helps us, whatever degree, as you're listening, you're sensing, okay, so to some degree, because of my ego, I don't like myself or trust myself. Whatever degree it is, how do we begin to recognize that and evolve ourselves in a way so we can feel at home? How do we evolve ourselves so that we can feel a sense of trusting the goodness of our own hearts, and by extension sensing that same loving presence is in everyone. It may not be awake, it may not be manifesting, but it's there. So I want to, for the rest of the time of this talk, look at the strategies, and this is more from a practice level now. And one of the strategies for evolving ourselves towards more trust is bringing mindfulness, starting right where we are, to the places where we feel separate. Bringing a mindful, compassionate attention to any place we're feeling doubt, separation, or mistrust, or any of the difficult emotions that come out of that. And the second area of practice that we'll talk about, and we're going to practice together, is to actively cultivate seeing the good. Actively cultivate the heart to feel love, because any moment that in a visceral way your heart feels open and tender, you will trust yourself more. And by extension, you'll trust others. So I thought I'd maybe, looking at these two areas, share pretty early in my spiritual practice, early in my 20s when I was in the ashram, one of the big wake-ups around trust that I had. And at this time, I was very new in an ashram community, and I was going through a really hard time. I felt very kind of disconnected from others and down on myself. And the kind of I was living in a yoga ashram, and the kind of ideology or philosophy was one of kind of climbing a ladder to perfection, that we're trying to purify ourselves so that our ego would fall away and we be just this glowing, pure light of wisdom and love. And so it had very much built in a kind of unconscious bias against ego, which, by the way, is really what causes so much suffering, because there's nothing wrong with ego. It's just being identified that this is me that causes the trouble. So there I was trying really hard to get rid of my ego, and the harder I tried, the more I became aware of just how big it was. I felt like, I remember, in some way talking about the yoga classes I was teaching, and I could hear in the tone how I was trying to make them sound like these fabulous classes, and how competitive I was in comparing with other people, and and just in doing the yoga, back then I was flexible and I was showing off. It's been very humbling over the years that I actually have a disease that makes it so that stretching is not good for me. So now I'm not flexible. That's karma, So anyway, I was watching my ego playing out and getting increasingly discouraged with the possibilities of ever being free. And I remember being in a women's group and in our ashram community, and basically saying, look, I know that I seem like I'm, doing well in different ways, but confessing that because of my ego the way it was, I just didn't trust myself. And it was a really big deal to confess that. It was like I was really naming my shadow and putting it out there and saying, I just don't like myself and I don't trust myself. And I remember it really well because, I have no idea what anybody said. Yeah, so I have no idea the responses. I just know that in naming it, something cracked open. I remember going back to my little room. It was this tiny little room that I lived in, and really just wide open in touch with all the pain of something is wrong with me. And so the practices start where you are. And it just came in waves, a sense of how imperfect I was, until after a while, after a lot of being with it and feeling this kind of brokenhearted at it and making space for it, more and more I was resting in a tender space. I was watching almost like a cartoon of my self character doing all these different things. And I realized as I was watching, that's not me. That's my story of self. These are some behaviors that come and go. The depth of who I am is this presence, this openness, this tenderness that's just paying attention and that's getting kinder by the moment. And that was a huge shift, because I went from being identified with this person who had a way too big ego to being awareness that was witnessing it, but not hooked or narrowed by it. This is, for me, a key juncture. And I've watched this with myself and many people, that with practice, more and more there's this shift. And the ego still does its thing, but there's less and less of a sense of being defined, and more freedom to sense who I am, who you are, who we are, is so much more mysterious and vast and deep and beautiful than any of these temporary patterns of thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And it actually gives us the freedom to then respond to our world that changes those thoughts and feelings and behaviors in a very natural way. So my aspiration became, whenever I'm caught in self-doubt, in not trusting myself, to pause and deepen my attention in that way of being mindful and present.